I just wanted to provide really quickly before we jump in, just a little bit more background about myself. As Jeff mentioned, I'm the co-founder and CEO of Virtuali. Before that, I worked primarily in management consulting and economics, and I'm also a millennial. I've spent a lot of time, a lot of my professional life outside of the U.S., primarily in Spain and Argentina. I really love to learn, but I also, more than that, I love to kind of teach and tutor and mentor. And that's really led me to Virtuali, where our mission is to really partner with companies and help them create amazing learning experiences that bridge the gap between millennials and corporate America. And so before we jump in, I just want to highlight what we're going to talk about today. I'm going to go over who the millennials are, then jump into the problem. Why are we really concerned with this group, and how are they impacting companies? And then finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about how we can fix it. And I'm going to base this primarily on our research on millennials and leadership development. And then finally, I've saved about 10 minutes at the end. If you guys have any questions and answers, I'd be more than happy to field those. So let's jump right in. Who are the millennials? There are actually a couple of different definitions that are out there. We generally tend to define millennials as those individuals who are born between 1980 and 2000. So this puts the oldest of the range at about 35 and the youngest at about 15. Now this is a really interesting point because at the higher end, we're seeing these individuals transition into leadership roles, and in some cases into senior leadership roles. And at the other end, some millennials are still in high school. So this is actually the largest generation in U.S. history, and I'd love to direct everyone's attention to the graph here. We're in 2014, which is a really interesting year. We can see that, this is the first time that the orange and green lines here are colliding. Millennials this year actually became the largest component of the workforce in the U.S., and they're going to continue to grow. Over the next 5 to 6 years, they're going to increase by about 15 million. And during that time, baby boomers are going to decrease by about the same amount. So Jeff mentioned this. There's a really big demographic shift going on in the U.S. and actually around the world. I know we have some folks who are joining from outside of the U.S. as well. Globally, millennials will represent 75% of the workforce by 2025. So we've begun to see the beginning of this shift, and it's only going to increase over the next 10 years or so. Jumping into our next slide here, I wanted to talk a little bit about the differences. Are millennials actually that different? And I've used one of my favorite tools online here. It's called the Google Books Ngram Viewer. And what this allows us to do is see when words were introduced and how they've evolved, how their usage has evolved over time. So on the left, I've chosen these two words strategically. They're self-esteem and the internet. I think these are the two biggest influences on the millennial generation, at least in the United States. On the left, we see this idea of self-esteem really got started around 1940, 1950, and it became very prevalent around the time that baby boomers were growing up, becoming adults, and having children. It had a big impact on the way that millennials were raised. I'm not going to go into too much detail here. I'll recommend two books. One is by the individual Neil Howe, who actually coined the term millennial, and another great book is Generation Me. But suffice it to say that really the outcome of this style of parenting, if you're an optimist, you say that millennials tend to be really confident. They have high standards and high expectations. If you're a little bit more on the pessimistic side, there are those that have suggested that millennials can tend to be a bit narcissistic and entitled. On the right, the internet has had a huge impact on millennials as well. And I think the interesting thing to point out here is that millennials really don't know a world without the internet. They've really seen this democratizing force that has eroded traditional hierarchies and power structures. The example that I love to give is Napster, where you have a 20-year-old guy who builds a piece of software and absolutely revolutionizes the music and the media industry. Another really big impact that the internet has had, and that I think we're seeing increasingly, is what I like to call this, this idea of instantaneity. Everything with the internet is on demand, it's right now, it's always very relevant, and this has had a big, has shaped millennials' outlook, and it's also has a big impact on learning and the way that companies need to think about learning, which we'll get into a little bit later. So with that very, very brief overview about millennials' demographics and their qualitative characteristics, I want to jump into this idea, what is the problem? Why are we talking about millennials today? My company conducted a study. It was about 525 millennials, and we wanted to understand their views towards leadership, and the types of training that they're receiving. And what we found is really interesting. Millennials have very big leadership aspirations. You can see on this slide, moving from top to bottom, an overwhelming number of millennials consider it to be very important to be leaders. Fewer are actually consider themselves to be leaders in their companies, and fewer still actually have a formal leadership role. This tells us, I think, two things. One, leadership is a very important concept to this group. But secondly, the idea of leadership that millennials have isn't necessarily the same as the idea of formal leadership that we have. Being a VP or an SVP is one way to look at being a leader, but millennials tend to have a more fluid and a more dynamic view of leadership. A lot of times the situation can dictate if one is a leader or not, and the degree to which one has influence can be a leader. We heard these themes, in our survey, and also when we did follow-up interviews with some of the participants. The problem, however, is that millennials aren't quite ready. There's a bit of a tension here in the millennial generation. We can see that they want to become leaders, but they're not quite there yet. This data comes from a survey that was conducted by Deloitte of global millennials, and they found that just over 40% of this group are actually already managers, and they're managing groups of 4 or more direct reports. And at the same time, though, they almost 2/3 didn't feel ready when they jumped into this role. The top concerns they cited include managing conflict, managing different people, developing people. And so again, we see a tension here with millennials that they want to assume these roles, but they need a little bit more of a boost. The second problem that millennials have really caused for companies is with regard to engagement levels and turnover. You can see on the left here that about a little bit over 2/3 of millennials are considered to be disengaged at work. This figure actually comes from a survey conducted by the Gallup organization. And what it causes is really high turnover. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the average tenure of a millennial employee is about 3 years. Now, part of this is due to the fact that millennials are younger and haven't had the time to be in jobs for a long period, but it's also very much due to the way that millennials view their careers and the way they look at the workplace. And what this has really done to a lot of companies is kind of caused them to fall into what we call the Millennial Wheel of Death. And I realize that this is a little bit small, and you might not be able to read it, so I'll kind of call it out. Really, we're in this vicious circle where we have a large percentage of millennials who are disengaged at work, which then leads them to leave jobs. This becomes very costly for companies. In fact, the average cost of a millennial leaving is about $25,000. Because of that, millennial companies become reluctant to invest in millennials, which then makes millennials see less of a future at the company, which then makes them more disengaged. And you can see how these circumstances lead to a situation in which companies are seeing very high turnover, low engagement, and millennials are not quite finding the niche and the experience that they're looking for. And so the question then becomes, how do we fix this? How can we break this vicious cycle and get to a point where companies are able to attract millennials, engage them, develop them, and ultimately keep them? The first step in this process to me is understanding what millennials want. And a key component of that is realizing that millennials value experiences. Eventbrite, which is an online event management company, did a survey, and they found that nearly 80% of millennials value experiences over possessions. Some of you may be familiar with this acronym or this hashtag FOMO. It stands for fear of missing out. And I think that this small acronym has really come to represent a big part of the millennial psyche. If you can think about someone in this position, they're constantly bombarded with information on LinkedIn and Facebook. They're pondering whether they should go to grad school or pursue an MBA, change careers, maybe quit entirely and go traveling. There's really so many options these days, and they're much more visible than ever. And so I think part of perhaps the crisis that millennials are facing is that they don't quite know what to do. And unfortunately for companies, in order to get the different experiences they're looking for, oftentimes it means leaving the company that they're with to go pursue a job somewhere else. I think the silver lining in all of this is the third bullet on the slide, which is really the importance of learning and development. Monster.com did a study in conjunction with millennial branding, and they found that more than any other generational segment of the workforce, millennials really value learning and development. In fact, I find this statistic really to be rather remarkable. A third of millennials actually consider learning and development to be a company's top benefit, and that's above other things like salary benefits. The traditional draws that we think about when we try to figure out why people choose different companies. And so with that last bullet, learning, this is kind of the topic of our talk here, learning can be a big part of the solution. Learning can really help companies not only bridge the gap to develop future leaders, but it can also be used as a type of perk to not only attract people, but keep them engaged and retain them. The caveat here, the big caveat, is it has to be done right. And in our mind, there are really three keys to doing this correctly, and those are content, delivery, and frequency. In terms of content, the key really here is relevance. And it goes back to what we were talking about in terms of the internet. I read an interesting statistic the other day that about a quarter of millennials have either never had cable TV or they've canceled their cable TV. And why is that the reason? Well, they're going on Netflix, they're going on Hulu, they're going and seeking out the content that they want as opposed to having it delivered to them in some kind of prepackaged constraint. And I think that really, that really colors the way that they view content and how engaged they are. If you are not giving them something that's relevant to them or showing them how it is relevant, they're not going to pay attention. And so it may be unfortunate, but it's also a reality. In terms of delivery, we've seen that really the best strategy here is to combine e-learning, in-person learning, and more kind of a hands-on experiential type approach. And getting that combination right is really the key to engaging learners and making sure that you're getting the content to them in a way that's going to resonate. Lastly, frequency. Again, I'm going to bring up this concept of the internet, everything being on demand. Today, when you're faced with a problem, what do we all do? We go to Google, maybe we go to a specialized website like Stack Exchange if you're a computer programmer, or look for a YouTube tutorial. That has an impact on the way that companies train their employees. We can't fall into this pattern of doing once-a-year trainings. There's nothing wrong with them per se, but we need a blended approach that combines the scheduled trainings with trainings that are more on demand and integrated into the job. And so here's the million-dollar question. What is the right content? What is the right delivery? What is the right frequency? I'm going to share the answers from our survey, but the real answer here is you should ask your employees. I've provided a screenshot here. This is the basis of the survey results that I'm going to share with you now. It's available for free on our website. You're more than welcome to use our methodology, or you can develop your own. But I think the real key here is, go out, talk to your employees, understand what do they want to learn, what do they need to learn, and how do they prefer to learn it, and at what frequency. That's always going to be your true north. And so we would definitely, while we're going to share our results, definitely encourage you, to go out and do that. And if you're interested, you can absolutely contact me afterwards for ways to do that effectively. So now I'm going to jump in and I'm going to talk about, according to our results, what we found to be best in terms of content, delivery, and frequency. So our next slide here, we asked, and again, we're focused here on leadership development, so I want to set the stage a little bit. Things that we're less concerned with here are things like compliance training, maybe required trainings to keep up an accounting certificate, things like that. And what we found is we asked millennials what they believed were the most valuable skills, and then what were they best at and where they need the biggest improvement. And we found a couple really interesting things. First, there seemed to be a very high value placed on soft skills. So in column A here, we see communication, building relationships, the ability to develop others. These are things that millennials value very highly. When we conducted follow-up interviews, we asked why. And oftentimes the answer we got was, we're increasingly working in teams, and we're asked to work cross-functionally with people from marketing, software developers, sales individuals. And while technical expertise is really important, the people that can really have an impact are those that can bring all of these folks together, get them on the same page, and help them work towards a common goal. And so that was something that we saw, and something that millennials believe that they're strong on, but we did want to continue. Conversely, we saw a little bit less of an emphasis on soft skills, so things, or on hard skills, things like industry expertise, technical expertise, general business management. But my biggest takeaway from this slide, if everyone can see this third row here, the ability to develop others, this was ranked with the other soft skills among the most valuable skills, but it was ranked among the weakest. And I think this is really telling, going back to our discussion of this tension. Millennials want the opportunity to lead, but they're not quite ready. And I think that came out here rather strong. Of all the characteristics on this list, the ability to develop others is the one that's really singularly part of management and part of leadership. And so when you look at this type of survey and you think, where do my employees really need to develop? It's really in this third area, the ability to develop others. Jumping into delivery, we asked millennials, going again from left to right here, we asked what types of delivery mechanisms had been used in their workplace in the past 12 months, which were the most impactful, and then regardless of whether or not they had participated, what did they actually want the most? And we found a few interesting things here as well. The number one result was coaching and mentorship. Became a very common activity. I believe something like 50% of millennials had actually had access to this. And far and away, it was voted the most impactful activity and one of the most desired activities. I think that this could be a really quick win for companies who want to make an impact. Having this type of highly individualized learning is very, very impactful, and it's also very cost-effective. Now, you can set up a mentorship program in your company almost cost-free, and it does have a big impact. I think if we think back one moment to this idea of fear of missing out and the bombardment of so many different options, what we heard when we talked to these people that we interviewed was they're a little lost and they want guidance. And if that guidance can be provided by people within a company, and a path can be carved out in that company, that's going to go a long way to engaging those individuals, showing them they have a future, and ultimately finding and keeping the best people. Moving on here, another really interesting result was e-learning. Again, this ranked among the 4 most participated in activities, but it was actually one of the least impactful and the least desired of all. This isn't necessarily a rejection of e-learning per se. I think it's more the way that companies are using e-learning and the way that they're rolling it out. What we heard when we talked to participants was, there's sometimes an over-reliance on e-learning, and it wasn't blended enough with other forms like in-person, experiential. And so you might anticipate that millennials, for all of their tech savviness, for all of their use of computers and technology, would be very open to e-learning, but we found that almost across the board that was not the case. Lastly, I want to point out a couple of different categories here. Rotations and assignments and externships. These were among the activities that folks really didn't have access to, but if you look in the third column, these are really highly desired activities. And what this tells me is that the mix of learning that companies are providing isn't quite right. There's probably a little bit too much e-learning. I think it seems like there's a great amount of coaching and mentorship, although there's always the opportunity to do more. And really what's lacking in that balance is experiential learning, right? So perhaps giving your employees the opportunity to work on a special project, rotate into a different department. The externship idea is probably the most extreme. That would be when employees can go work for another company for a week to learn and network and all of that. And there's really a lot of demand for these activities, and companies that will be able to provide them, I think we'll be able to really, again, engage and retain individuals in this demographic. Finally, we asked people how many hours of leadership development training they had received in the last 12 months, and we got a pretty interesting distribution here. About a quarter of individuals actually had no leadership development, And then most common was to have between 1 and 10 hours and 11 and 20. And then from there, it really trailed off. With the exception of the last category, we had a large number of respondents from consulting and accounting firms. And in the professional services industry, the emphasis on leadership development and training tends to be a bit higher. So we had some outliers at the end of the spectrum. But what we saw overwhelmingly was, out of an entire year, most people are getting about 1 day of leadership development training. And when we look at the satisfaction scores, we ask these folks, are you happy? Are you happy with the quality, and are you happy with the quantity? We got a mixed bag. You see about 50% of the people said, yes, what happened was excellent, and the other half said no. It wasn't excellent. There was a lot of room for improvement. And what this says to me is that there's a really big opportunity for companies to do this very well and really stand out from their competitive set. We looked into the data because we had a number of attributes about each of the survey respondents. We knew how big the company was that they worked in. We knew the industry. We knew their title. And we disaggregated the data, and we tried to understand, are big companies doing this better? Are companies in the consulting industry doing this better? And what we found was there was really no pattern. What drives satisfaction for learning and for leadership development among the sample of individuals that we had was the company. Some companies were small and they did this extremely well. Some companies were large and they didn't. And so, you don't have to necessarily be a Fortune 500 company with a global presence to provide the right types of opportunities. You can do this regardless. It just takes, knowing your audience and tailoring the learning to match them. And so we're kind of nearing the end here. I wanted to close with two really quick examples that I think are illustrative of the things that we've been talking about. And the first, I'm posing kind of a rhetorical question that I guess I'll go ahead and answer. Wharton is the business school at the University of Pennsylvania. Pretty famously, about 2 or 3 years ago, they decided that they were going to go ahead and take their first-year MBA curriculum, and they were going to put it online with a company called Coursera. They were basically going to open it up. Anyone could sign up for free, and they could take a series of classes. Here you can see this is a financial accounting class. There were marketing classes and several different classes. And it's an interesting thing to take a step back and ask, why would the University of Pennsylvania do that? They're in the business of making money off of education. They obviously want people to matriculate and enroll. And I think the answer is, they understand that the future of education is not going to be about content. Content really is the price of admission, but with all of the access that we have to knowledge these days, content is becoming increasingly commoditized. The value that an organization like the University of Pennsylvania provides to its students is everything that happens after the lecture or after the textbook. It's being in class with very smart people. It's discussing issues with them. It's solving problems, working in teams, addressing the conflicts in those teams, trying to get to a solution with a group of people that you may not know. Really grappling with new problems that aren't in the textbooks yet. This is the future of education, and so when companies think about how they can engage and train their employees, I would challenge them to not think so much about the content, but what is the experience that they can provide in addition to that content? How can they enable their employees to apply that knowledge that they're gaining in a novel way that's going to teach them through experience. And I'm gonna close here with one final example. This is a picture of a group of individuals who participated in I guess you could call it an activity at Deloitte. It's called Deloitte 2 International, or D2I. This actually, I left Deloitte, unfortunately, before they had this program, but it was founded by a good friend of mine named Russ Gaw. And it's an example of, doing this extremely well. Basically what happens is Deloitte takes its junior practitioners, it pairs them with an NGO internationally, and they do a pro bono project for the NGO. This group, I believe, happened to go to Serbia. So they worked with an NGO in Serbia for about a month and a half, virtually helping them solve a business problem. And then at the end of that project, they all took personal time off. They did the project in their free time, and they went over to Serbia to finalize the project and meet the people that they've been working with. And for me, when you look at what millennials are looking for out of their career, they're looking for experiences. They're looking to learn. A program like this is incredible. It checks so many boxes. The junior employees who are working on this, they get mentored by senior employees, by leaders and managers in the firm. They make a real impact. They make a real impact in a philanthropic way. We didn't mention philanthropy, but that's something that's very, very vital to millennials in the workplace. They learn, and they not only learn maybe a new framework or a new methodology, but they actually apply that learning. They also have an amazing travel and travel experience. And you know, look, you can see everyone in this picture. They're all smiling. They had an amazing time. They came together as a team. And so I think that, you know, companies who are able to offer experiences, and this may be the extreme, but experiences that bring together, you know, so many of these different experiences and ideas that millennials are looking for will really be able to make a big difference. So before we jump into Q&A session, I really just wanted to kind of recap on today's key takeaway. You know, number one, the millennials are here. They're here, and they're transitioning into leadership positions, and they're going to continue to come. You know, by 2025, there's going to be 75% of the workforce will be millennials. We see that there are two big gaps. There's a leadership gap, and there's an engagement gap. And I believe that learning is really can be a key tool that companies can use to bridge both of these gaps. And the ones that do it well, there's a very big opportunity to not only attract the best employees, but also engage them, provide the experiences that they're looking for, and ultimately keep them. So Jeff, I don't know if you're there. That's pretty much everything that I had. Do we have time for a few questions?
Yeah, I believe we... Hi, Sean. This is Mark Miller. Yeah, I think that we do have a little bit of time for some questions. And one question that we've got relates to what the research is around what employers' perceptions match what millennials want and need. So the idea of how have you seen research that has shown whether different companies are able to match the perceptions of what millennials want to need versus what they actually provide, and examples maybe of organizations that you know have done that really well for either from a content, a delivery, or a frequency standpoint?
Sure, that's a great question. I want to flip back. Let's see if I can find the slide here really quickly. So what we're looking at here, I think this partly answers the question. You know, we asked if you compare, you know, column A here with column C. This is really, you know, what's happening on the ground at companies, and you know what millennials would prefer. So again, what we see here is, you know, they really want coaching, they really want experiential learning, and they want less e-learning. Versus what's happening, you know, where they're getting too much e-learning and not enough, you know, not enough of the experiential stuff. You know, I mentioned Deloitte. I think that's a great example. I'll venture to give two more. One is another consulting firm. It's called Bain Consulting, Bain Company. They have a great program where after the first 2 years, business analysts can choose either to do a rotation in the private equity branch of the firm. They can choose to go to one of Bain's offices around the world, or they can choose to do an externship in an industry to learn more about that industry. And that's just hugely popular with folks who join that company because they really, again, have this chance to learn in a way that's extremely engaging and that provides a very, very unique experience. Another good example is a firm based in New York City. It's an algorithmic trading firm called Jane Street. And they again have, you know, an amazing learning program. They also provide the opportunity for their employees to visit one of their international hubs, I believe London and Hong Kong, or where they have other offices. And they bring in amazing speakers. So they'll bring in, you know, individuals from the Federal Reserve. They'll bring in academic economists. They even bring in, you know, athletes to talk about leadership. And you know, it's a very collaborative and a very in an environment that has an extreme focus on learning and improvement. And so, you know, I think those are a couple of companies that come to mind for me that are really doing an excellent job of using learning to really attract and engage a millennial audience.
That's excellent, Sean. Thanks for those examples. One thing that a couple of questions have related to is some of the myths around millennials and what that actually means in the workplace. So whether and whether they are myths. There's the idea of, are millennials just short attention span, quick hit? Are they sort of self-involved? And what is that? How does that impact the way that you can train millennials, knowing that from what the research shows, they really are focused on how they can build relationships in meaningful ways. So from this content delivery and frequency idea, which I really love, which hits at everything related to learning, how do companies overcome some of those biases?
Yeah, so I'll address that last part first. I think the analogy that I like to make is that of the traditional newspaper versus maybe like an app that would aggregate news. The latter, having an app that will give you news that you're very interested in on topics that you care about, I think that's really great, and that's the kind of millennial side of this. It's really good to be able to go find those things that you're interested in and learn about them. And the downside to that is you have the tendency perhaps to only learn about the same things. Maybe you don't challenge the perspective that you have, and so I think the balance to that is reading something like a daily newspaper, where you have someone who curates information and makes sure you get a good representation of the knowledge that you need. And I think that's where companies can step in. I think there needs to be a healthy amount of curation so that millennials aren't just learning the things that they want to learn and focus on the skills that they want to improve. And so I think that the companies have the opportunity to do that. Now they also, I think, have to meet millennials halfway. And a lot of this, again, goes back to this, growing up with the internet, growing up with almost limitless information, limitless access to information, essentially on demand and instantaneously. So when you're looking to, train on things that might not be, the most popular, the most interesting right off the bat, I think, using delivery methods that are familiar, on demand, having a library, having, references that can be accessed is really important. But I do think that companies need to perhaps push back a little bit more. I think the interesting thing though here is you talked in the beginning of your question a little bit about perception, and that's what I was talking about self-esteem earlier in the presentation. I said I think a lot of this depends on your perspective. You could see it in millennials as entitled, or you could see them as really highly motivated and highly entrepreneurial. And I think to an extent it depends on the company's perspective. You can certainly see millennials as entitled, but I think you can also use that sense of entitlement or those high expectations and really harness them to make millennials more effective employees.
That's a great answer, Sean, and I think that is exactly right. There is no silver bullet, but really keying in on the fact that not all millennials are the same, and you can't always bucket people into one categorical definition, but realizing that the things that are innate to how they have always learned in school, the access to information, and really focusing that on how each person is going to be able to develop their own leadership perspective, develop relationships, key in on those communication elements that we've seen in every generation and in every organization as being the most critical ways that people actually develop. That's what's going to carry the day moving forward.
Yeah, and just to really quickly add, we're kind of in the emergenetics 24 hours here. The generation that someone belongs to is one of any number of attributes that defines that person. We also, among millennials, obviously have people who are perhaps more analytical or more feelings-based. And so, the way that you deliver training isn't only geared towards, someone's age or what generation they belong to, but also how they process information and how they like to learn. So, we can't lose sight of those other identifiers and only focus in on this one thing, even though I do believe it's a very important.
Well, that's very well stated, Sean. And I think, unfortunately, we have a bunch more questions, and so we will, again, send these to Sean so that he can address these. This is obviously a very popular topic, and Sean, really well done in terms of what the content is all about and how we can engage this whole generation of folks who are going to shape the workplace moving forward. So thank you again to Sean Graber, co-founder and CEO of Virtuali, and we look forward to continuing to have folks on the call for our final 4 participants this afternoon in Emerging Next 24 Hours. Thanks again, Sean.
Thank you all so much.